Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Wow. That was for me, by the way. Hi, everybody. I'm David Remnick, editor of The New Yorker, and welcome to the New Yorker Festival. Thank you. This is the 25th New Yorker Festival, amazingly enough, and next year we turn 100 years old, as you can see. I am really delighted to be here at this pivotal moment in our political American history. It is a very, very complicated time. Strange alliances are being made all the time, it turns out, and that is a good thing. Before we begin, I have a couple of housekeeping matters. Please silence your cell phones, and if you're inclined to take flash photography, don't take flash photography. And if you are inclined to post on social media, the festival hashtag is New Yorker Fest. We've got about an hour together, including time at the end for some questions for all of you in the audience, and you can submit those questions at any time by texting festival to the number on the screen behind me, which I dearly hope is actually, and I'm not pointing like an idiot, it's there, right? You see it? Good. So without further ado, let me begin our discussion. Liz Cheney served as U.S. Representative for Wyoming's at-large Congressional District from 2017 to 2013. She chaired the House Republican Conference, the third highest position in the House Republican leadership, from 2019 to 2021, and served as the vice chair. And this was just a crucial moment in American history that just seems like it's receded very quickly, but it was crucial. Served as the vice chair of the Select Committee investigating the insurrection on January 6, 2021. The last time we spoke is when your memoir came out called Oath and Honor, a memoir and a warning. The warning is severe. Let me begin with the most elemental question of all. We were inside talking a little bit, and you made a prediction about the election. What is it, and why do you think it's true?
Kamala Harris is going to be the next president of the United States. And David and I were talking. You know, I've obviously been around campaigns for a long time, and I have having had, I think, a perspective that very few people have, having been deeply involved and engaged inside Republican presidential politics, and now on the other side. You know, when I look at having spent time on the road campaigning with Vice President Harris, having watched her interact with and talk to independent voters, undecided voters, and looking at the electorate and looking at what is really driving voters this time around. We are a very closely divided nation, there's no question. But when you think about, at the end of the day, what is really moving people, one of the things that is really moving people, and I would say especially women, is what a second Trump term would mean for the women of this country. And women, and I say this, you know, as someone who, on issues connected to reproductive health, someone who has been pro-life, but there are women across this country who are watching what's happening in places like Texas, in places like North Carolina, who are watching state legislatures make decisions that are preventing women from getting fundamental basic health care. And at the end of the day, when you look at the numbers of voters, when you look at the percentages of women who vote versus percentages of men, and when you look at what's really going to be necessary to ensure that we have a president who believes in the rule of law, who believes in the Constitution, a president who's going to defend what matters for us, for our kids, for our grandkids, I think that we will see absolutely that you've got a lot more people who will be voting for Vice President Harris who may not be saying it publicly, but at the end of the day, it'll be enough to pull her over the edge.
Just to put a little pressure on that point in terms of prediction, in 2016, the polls underpolled Donald Trump. In 2020, that happened again, in fact, rather severely in some states. Why won't that happen again?
I think there are a couple things going on. One is that you've got polling and modeling that has been changed specifically because of that. Secondly, what we have seen each time is that Donald Trump really has a ceiling. And again, this doesn't mean that people need to sit back and stop working and not run through the tape. And particularly in swing states, it's going to be crucially important not only that Vice President Harris win, but that margin of victory be as big a margin as it can possibly be, because we know what Donald Trump and his supporters will be trying to do in too many cases.
You were campaigning with Kamala Harris 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago?
Last week.
And you were in a really resonant place. You were in Ripon, Wisconsin.
That was a couple weeks ago, yeah.
And you made a joint appearance with her. This is the birthplace of the Republican Party. And it was a beautiful day. It's a very pretty town. I've been there. The crowd is chanting, "Thank you, Liz." And as you began to speak with the microphone in front of you, as you are now, you choked up. And I wonder if you could narrate that moment for us. What were you feeling, and what was on your mind?
Well, it was unexpectedly moving for me, and there were a couple of reasons. One was that my daughter was there with me, and my husband, and my daughter the Harris campaign had asked me a couple of days earlier what I wanted my walk-on music to be, which I hadn't anticipated needing walk-on music. But I happened to be with one of my daughters when the request came in, and she immediately said, "Change, Taylor Swift, Taylor's version, change." And there are some wonderful lines in there, like, "They may be bigger, but we're faster, and we're never scared." And so when I first walked on stage and I heard Change playing, and I looked over and I saw my daughter, and she was emotional, and then just the setting of the whole thing, and the feeling of, I mean, it was very nice to hear people saying thank you, but it was also just a moment that felt like it was a bigger moment than politics, and to be there, to be saying, look, as a country, we only survive if we elect people who are going to abide by their oaths of office, and to be there at where the Republican Party was founded. I was born in Wisconsin also, so it always feels like coming home, and I felt like the party that I belonged to has left so many of the principles that the party once stood for, and being able to talk about that and talk about fundamentally this is there's a level of cruelty in what Donald Trump is and who he is, and that cruelty is reflected in what he did on January 6th when he watched the attack on television and refused to tell the mob to leave. It's reflected in what he's done in the aftermath of the hurricane, where he lies to people about where they can get aid and relief. And looking at this question of, are we going to have a president who's a fundamentally cruel and depraved person, or are we going to elect Kamala Harris, who she and I don't agree on a number of issues, but man, I absolutely know that she's going to do what she believes is right for our country, and she's going to abide by the Constitution. And I think that all came together to be a very moving moment.
In recent days, we've read accounts of how the former Chief of Staff, John Kelly, and others have described how Donald Trump has expressed admiration for Adolf Hitler. Mark Milley, who's the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said that Trump is a fascist. You've heard the F word is very much in the air. And it seemed unsayable before. Adam Gopnik, for example, wrote an essay for us many months ago. Ostensibly, it was a book review about the rise of fascism in Germany, but it was so obviously an essay about what's happening now in the United States. Is Donald Trump a fascist?
I think that you'd be hard-pressed to say he's not. And I also think it's really important, you saw that after General Kelly spoke out, for example, the Trump people immediately started to say, well, this is a political attack. They started to attack General Kelly, who's a 4-star Marine general and a Gold Star father. And I think it's really important that we not let them get away with that, and that we realize, what does it mean? Everybody has to stop and think to themselves, this is Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff, who, in addition to saying that Donald Trump spoke admiringly of Hitler, he talked about Donald Trump standing in the section where General Kelly's own son is buried at Arlington, and in cemeteries in Europe, saying, the people that have given the ultimate sacrifice for the country are losers and suckers. And as a nation, I think we become, in some ways, numb, because Donald Trump says so many things that are so horrible so often, we become numb to it. But I think it's really important to take a step back, and this goes back to your first question, which is that we have this unprecedented coalition, this unprecedented wave of support for Vice President Harris that you've never seen before, at least in modern political history, from Republicans. And it's from people who used to work for Donald Trump at the highest levels, who say they can't support him, and some of them have come out publicly to say they're supporting her. It is from national security officials across Republican administrations. I mean, you all know how unusual that is, and you see it day by day by day. And frankly, some of the bravest people who have stood up are people like the mayor of Waukesha, Wisconsin. Very Republican area of Wisconsin, long-serving Republican mayor, who has come out publicly and said, I'm voting for Vice President Harris. And when you see that, those people don't have to do that. And like I believe there'll be millions of Americans who just cast the vote and don't speak publicly. But that also tells you where we are.
Mitch McConnell has, in a book that's about to be published, I think it's an oral history, Mitch McConnell calls Trump stupid, a despicable human being, unfit. Mitch McConnell endorses Donald Trump. Well, yeah. Could you help me with that?
Yeah. I mean, well, I think specifically with respect to Mitch McConnell, there were sort of two different approaches after January 6th. One was the one taken by Kevin McCarthy, which was, within a week or two after January 6th, after he'd condemned Trump and said Trump bore responsibility for the attack, he was down begging Trump at Mar-a-Lago to give him access to Trump's donor lists, and completely embracing Trump back into our politics again. That was the McCarthy approach. The McConnell approach was, to talk publicly about how terrible Donald Trump was, about how disgraceful his behavior was, and then not to vote to convict him. And throughout that whole period, first of all, if McConnell had voted to convict him, we wouldn't be where we are today. Donald Trump would have been convicted. And you know, McConnell's approach for a lot of the period since January 6th was, let's just ignore him. You know, if you just ignore him, don't talk about him, he'll go away. And then when that quit working, McConnell decided to endorse him. I mean, it's like really the opposite of a profile in courage. And I think it's you know, now you're going to see apparently in this book, I've just seen the excerpts of it as well.
Yeah, this is a book, 3 decades of private oral histories by a man named Michael Tackett, and it's...
No, it's stunning. And look, the big lesson of this is leadership matters. Leadership really matters. And we have seen, I mean, you've written about, in Lenin's tomb, which I think won the Pulitzer Prize, if I'm not mistaken, about the Soviet Union. And you know, we've seen throughout history how autocrats come to power, how important it is for them to be successful. They have to destroy the truth, and they have to have people who enable them. And so what we've seen inside the Republican Party, elected officials, is, you know, the very same kind of behavior that we've seen throughout history when it comes to autocrats and tyrants.
But what's stunning to me is this. A few weeks ago, we published excerpts from the prison diaries of Alexei Navalny. Alexei Navalny went back to Russia knowing he would be imprisoned and would likely die in a prison cell. He did not have to do that, and nobody would have faulted him if he had remained in Germany after having been poisoned nearly to death by the FSB. We don't expect ordinary human beings, we don't expect of ourselves, probably, to give our lives routinely for principle. But what drives Mitch McConnell to such hypocrisy? What drives the owner of the Washington Post to refuse to allow his own newspaper to publish an endorsement? This is not like he would sit in a prison cell. The stakes for somebody like that are, compared to Alexei Navalny, nothing.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, on the issue of the Washington Post, look, first of all, it's fear. And fear is Putin's weapon too. You know, fear is how autocrats govern. And so while I think it's really, you know, it's a disgrace that the Post apparently decided to pull the endorsement, I would say, number one, that isn't going to affect a single undecided voter anywhere in this country. But it absolutely proves the point that Vice President Harris and those of us have been making about the danger of Donald Trump. When you have Jeff Bezos apparently afraid to issue an endorsement for the only candidate in the race who's a stable, responsible adult because he fears Donald Trump, that tells you why we have to work so hard to make sure that Donald Trump isn't elected. And I think also why we ought to not forget what has happened, forget who's taken brave and courageous stands. And I canceled my subscription to the Washington Post, just saying.
Look, I have no illusions. We published a 5,000-word endorsement of Kamala Harris a few weeks ago. No. I had no illusion that suddenly the state of Wyoming and Montana and Kansas would fall over backwards and say, oh my God, the New Yorker has endorsed Kamala Harris. My mind has changed. I get that. But all it is an opportunity to state a cogent case in a principled position. The danger is low. What seems to me to raise the danger is to signal to the autocrat that his people are weak. And his people, even the wealthiest among them, will bow down. And without a spine, you cannot stand up.
Right. And that is... Look, I spent a lot of years before I was elected to Congress working around the world, working in Eastern Europe, and I worked in Russia and in Ukraine and across the Middle East. And, you know, there were many moments that really affected me. You know, at the very beginning of my career, I was in Nizhny Novgorod, Russia. I was working for USAID, and I met this incredible young man who was the mayor of Nizhny Novgorod. His name was Boris Nemtsov. And he really believed in helping to lead his people to freedom. And he spent a career doing that, a lifetime doing that. And Vladimir Putin had him gunned down on the streets outside the Kremlin, ultimately. And so when you see firsthand, or when you read the history of the sacrifices around the world and in our own country that people have made for our freedom, that people have made to live in democracy, you see the signs. And again, I mean, Donald Trump is absolutely using the playbook that autocrats have used before. And I do know, though, and I spend a lot of time traveling around the country speaking to audiences, if you ask just about any group of Americans, any place in this country, if you say, do you want your children to live in a country where we have the peaceful transfer of power? It doesn't matter what the political makeup is of the audience. We all want that. And that's what is at stake on November 5th. And that's why, you know, as I talk to people who aren't politically engaged, you know, much of the time because they are doing real work, they get it. They know that's what's at stake. And they know that casting a vote for Donald Trump means that you're willing to let that all slip away. And ultimately, that's not going to happen.
Is the lure of partisan politics that severe, though? You voted for Trump in 2016 and again in 2020. And it was really not until the insurrection on Capitol Hill that you broke. I have that right?
Yeah, I spoke out against him very clearly when he did and said things that I thought, you know, clearly had gone beyond.
But when you look back on it, what were you making an accommodation because you overlapped on certain issues? In other words, how does this work?
I think it was a couple of things. I mean, it certainly is my biggest, you know, professional regret ever supporting him. But you know, you do get into a place, you know, when we certainly saw it happen with Trump, which is, well, he doesn't really mean, like, okay, what he's saying is crazy, but he doesn't really mean it. Which, of course, post-January 6th, you know, post the 2020 election, there's no question that he means it. And secondly, you know, I really thought that, look, when he first was in office, I had spent a lot of time around the White House and around presidents and you know, growing up watching presidents and then working in the State Department. And I knew the guardrails. You know, I knew, well, right, there's a National Security Council in the White House that walks the president through key decisions. And there's an executive secretary that makes sure the paper flows and the president signs off and gets decisions in front of the president. I understood that there was a structure there. And I had seen other presidents grow into the office. And so I thought he would grow into the office. And I think that, you know, the lesson that is so important for us now is to realize when he says things like, I'm going to terminate the Constitution, or I believe that, you know, the enemy within is something that should be dealt with by the deployment of military force. He means those things. And you don't have to take my word for it. You can take the word of the people who stopped him from doing many of those things the last time around, and those people won't be with him this time around.
Give me some insight in what it took for your father to make a similar decision and why George W. Bush has not.
Well, it was not a difficult decision at all for my dad. He has been absolutely, I would say, as concerned for maybe even longer than I have been about the danger that Donald Trump poses. And I can't explain why George W. Bush hasn't spoken out, but I think it's time, and I wish that he would.
The Biden administration's Department of Justice moved, I think it can be argued, extremely deliberately, slowly, to prosecute the cases against Trump over January 6th, so slowly that the cases against him have not really begun almost 4 years later and could not be resolved before he ran for president. That he would run again and that his candidacy would complicate the case against him were entirely predictable in 2021. How big an error was that? What happened?
Well, I think that the Justice Department, right after January 6th, they focused very much on cases that were, you know, the people that had invaded the Capitol. I don't fault them. I mean, that's been a historic and historically important set of prosecutions for those who broke into the Capitol.
But
those
if I
who,
can interrupt, why concentrate on the knuckleheads and the lower level, and not on the most consequential historical part, the president himself?
Well, I don't think that I don't think it had to be an either or. I don't think it's unusual that you work up to the most senior person, that you watch a prosecution that begins at a lower level and works up to the more senior. And I do think, though, that it was very important that the work that we did on the Select Committee, in terms of pulling together the information that helped to explain why you couldn't just look at this as, well, this was somehow some kind of protest that got out of hand. But, once you saw the, witness after witness after witness that was Republican witnesses, I mean, almost all of our witnesses were Republicans. Most of them were the people who, the leadership of Donald Trump's campaign, his White House staff, most senior officials, Justice Department, most senior officials. And I do think that the work that we did on the committee, although, our focus was not as a congressional committee on prosecutions, but that work was really important in helping to make clear that there was a much bigger conspiracy here that the Justice Department needed to be focused on.
Mm-hmm. These days, Donald Trump would go before any audience say, Russia, Russia, Russia was all a fraud, and is dismissive and advertises the notion that somehow the Mueller committee absolved him, which is not the case. Tell me about what you think Donald Trump's relationship is to Vladimir Putin.
Well, I think that you really only have to ask yourself one question, and that is, why has Donald Trump never, as far as I know, said a critical word about Vladimir Putin? I mean, think about, Donald Trump, who, vomits at the mouth the most vile things you can imagine, but not about Vladimir Putin. That tells you a lot. And I think that there's also an element of praise for tyrants. He idolizes tyrants. He idolizes strongmen. And again, you can listen to him. Don't take my word for it. Listen to him talk about the genius and the brilliance and the spine of steel of people like Kim Jong-un and President Xi of China. And he said on tape multiple times that he wishes the American people would salute, basically, and listen to him carry out his orders the way that Kim Jong-un's people carry out his orders. I mean, that's what he thinks. The other thing I would say is, I did this recently. I went back and I read the final volume of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, their report on the Russia investigation. And it's worth taking the time to go back and read that, because it's clear that it was far from a hoax, and Donald Trump's way of dealing with it is to just to say again, Russia, Russia, Russia. But when somebody stands up next to Vladimir Putin and says they trust him more than they trust their own intelligence officers, I think we need to really think about what that means. And this raises another point about the danger that he poses. The President of the United States has obviously access to all of the very most sensitive intelligence that we have as a nation. And our country also shares intelligence with particular allies very closely. And, the idea that Donald Trump is going to be back in the White House again, we're going to find ourselves with allies who won't share intelligence because they know they can't trust Donald Trump. And we're going to find the nation unquestionably less safe because he can't be trusted. And again, you just have to look at what he says on a daily basis.
I guess the only reason, or one of the reasons I think there are no UFOs, is because apparently they tell the president all the secrets. And if there were UFOs and Donald Trump knew it, everybody would know it.
Yeah.
I think that's probably true. But are you suggesting that Trump is somehow beholden to Vladimir Putin and not just in his thrall as a fellow would-be autocrat?
I would just say everyone should ask themselves, why is he so hesitant?
I'm asking you.
I mean, ask yourself what that relationship is, and why would someone who wants so badly to be the American president, be in a position where he has worse things to say about fellow citizens than he does about foreign leaders. And also, why is Elon Musk on the phone with Vladimir Putin? I mean, I think these are all things we need to be very, very carefully thinking about.
What is our complicity in the creation of Donald Trump? I was interested to listen to the conversation this morning with Michael Beschloss, and he said, look, and he had nothing good to say about Donald Trump, but he said, there was 9/11, there were two misbegotten wars, there was NAFTA, which backfired in many ways for a lot of working class people. There was an economic collapse and its aftermath, and a growing inequality in this country. Some of these dynamics helped create Donald Trump, it seems to me, inarguably, or maybe you disagree.
I mean, I see it a little bit differently than that. I think that, certainly there has been growing inequality. I know that when I look at Wyoming and the state, the people that I used to represent, there's a very real and I believe legitimate concern and fear that people have that the government in Washington, that they can't influence it, nobody in Washington's listening to them, and that the people in Washington have unbelievable power. If somebody issues a regulation or makes a determination about something that's going on land that you're trying to graze cattle on, it'll destroy your livelihood immediately, and you feel like you have no recourse, no voice. And that is a very real thing. And I think that Donald Trump absolutely tapped into that. There's no question. And he tapped into it in a way that has really betrayed very good and honorable people around the country. I also think that some of the things we've been talking about in terms of not believing it could happen here, that absolutely has allowed him to get away with things that would have never been acceptable.
Is it his personality too? Sometimes I think of him as a kind of postmodern autocrat, almost like not Hitler but Charlie Chaplin playing it in the movie. And because I don't find it funny anymore and haven't for years, but kind of funny and presents himself as this kind of satirical version of himself, that he gets away with it more.
Well, I think, I think people will analyze it for years, but I think that the fundamentally important thing to understand, especially here we are 10 days out from the election, is he was willing to seize power illegally. He was willing to, use a violent mob to try to overturn the results of the election.
So you didn't think it was a festival of love?
Yeah, I mean, that's, he likes to say that, and every time he says it was a day of love, I urge people, go watch the video. Go watch the video of the attack on the west front of the Capitol, and think about, the Republicans are saying that they're the party of law enforcement. Donald Trump watched law enforcement officers be brutally beaten. He watched it on television while it happened, and refused to tell the mob to go home, and in fact fanned the flames while it was happening by tweeting about Mike Pence, that Mike Pence was a coward. He fanned the flames of it. So I think that, where we are as a nation today is that we have not only his words to go by, but we have his actions to go by. And the message of that and the lesson of that is very clear. I also, one more point on this. I think as elected officials, and frankly, even if you're not an elected official, politicians have, for a long time, probably as long as there's been politics, but we've been toxic, and we've launched attacks at each other. And one of the things I think is really important is when you're talking about a political adversary, and we got to a place in this country where you would hear political adversaries say that others were a threat to the Constitution or a threat to the future of the country. And what's happened is, I think, there's a tendency sometimes among voters to think, oh, we've heard politicians issue these warnings before, so, just to write off these warnings as just more politics. And I think that also means we all have a huge responsibility when this election's over. Why you need to look at the fact that you have a bipartisan coalition that is issuing these warnings about Donald Trump and Republicans, and realize, what it means that you've got so many Republicans unwilling to do that, but then also resolve ourselves when the election's done. And I know, again, this is something that Vice President Harris is very committed to, that we get back to being able to engage on substance and have vigorous debates about substance in a way that is policy focused and oriented.
But you called the Republican Party, I think you said this to Mark Leibovich, you called the Republican Party really sick right now. You said, I say this to my Republican colleagues who are defending the indefensible. There will come a day when Donald Trump is gone, but your dishonor will remain. The number, you talk about this coalition, and a coalition that I guess stretches from AOC to you.
Dick Cheney to Taylor Swift.
Or Dick Cheney, yeah, even.
I like to.
Fair enough. But there weren't too many people leaping out of Congress voluntarily to stand up.
Yeah, and I think it's,
in fact,
when I talk about
2 or 3.
Yeah, I mean, well, when I talk about the dishonor, I am talking about elected Republicans, and I think it is important to differentiate between elected Republicans and Republican voters writ large, because it is, the elected Republicans, and I certainly saw it up close in the House. They knew better, and they know better. They know what they're doing. When you have Republican elected officials who have, for their whole careers, been huge supporters of the United States military, and some of them veterans themselves, defense hawks, people who really believe in the importance of the defense of the nation, and you watched how many of them leapt out to attack General Kelly. I mean, it's despicable. And so I think that again, this is a place where people are going to look back at this, and there's a psychology about it.
Well, that's what I want to get at. We talked about this briefly inside. My question to you is this: are these jobs so good? In other words, is it so cool being a congressman or a senator that you will give up your soul to not have to go back to your home district and be a teacher again or some honorable profession? Is it so amazing that you will say in your soul, no, that Trump is what he is, and yet you come out and endorse him? I mean, I don't...
Yeah, I think, what I would say about that is anybody who thinks that way is not somebody that you ought to be voting for. And I think, it goes to the point like term limits, which is something that I've never been a fan of term limits for members of Congress. I think there are constitutional issues and other issues. But after I watched how many elected Republicans decided that their own reelection was more important than the oath they swore to the Constitution, I do think we need to think about things like term limits. But it's very much, there's an infinite, apparently, capacity for people to rationalize their behavior. And one of the things that I saw after the 2020 election was members of Congress who would say, and Mike Johnson was at the top of this list, we're just going to do this one more thing for Donald Trump. Just one more thing. We're just going to file this brief that Johnson knew was unconstitutional, illegal. We're just one more thing because that'll show him how much we support him, and then he'll concede and we can all move on. That's on the day of January 6th, before the attack, there were these sheets laid out in the Republican cloakroom. And I walked in, and I could see my colleagues walking down the list, signing their names on these sheets of paper. And I asked the staffer in the cloakroom what they were, and she said to me, well, those are the objections. And so people were saying, well, I'm going to object to the Arizona electors and Pennsylvania electors. And I sat there and I watched one of my colleagues come by, very big Trump supporter. And as he signed his name on the sheet, he said, kind of out loud to anybody who could hear, he said, the things we do for the orange Jesus. And so they know what they're doing. And I think that our job as voters and as citizens is to remind every elected official that some things matter. And your oath to the Constitution matters. And you have to vote for people, Democrats and Republicans. You ought to make that choice when you go to vote. Is this somebody I know above all else will defend the Constitution? That's the single most important thing as Americans we have to make sure of.
I think, you live long enough. You live long enough, you make mistakes. You live long enough, you change your mind. Sometimes it's not the courage of one's convictions, but it's the courage to change one's convictions. God knows it's happened to me. I've written things that I look back on and regret. In 2019, you said of the Democrats, they've become the party of anti-Semitism, they've become the party of infanticide, the party of socialism. That kind of rhetoric is nothing like you now. It's unrecognizable. Do you feel that you've changed markedly or on big issues like Iraq, or how do you look back on that?
There's a lot in that question. So first of all, let me touch on anti-Semitism, because I think that I don't remember that particular statement, but there were a couple of Democratic members who had said had tweeted some very clearly anti-Semitic tweets, and the Democrats in Congress refused to put legislation on the floor to condemn. I believe it was Representative Omar, and my view then and my view now is it doesn't matter which party is saying things that are anti-Semitic. All of us at all times have to stand against anti-Semitism. And so I think part of that I would not change. And I think that, you know, one of the real fallacies in this election is that somehow Donald Trump is going to be an ally of the state of Israel, an ally of the Jewish people. I mean, Donald Trump dined at Mar-a-Lago with Nick Fuentes, a Holocaust denier. J.D. Vance appeared on Tucker Carlson's show, blog, podcast, within days of Tucker Carlson platforming neo-Nazi propaganda from somebody who Carlson said he thought that was a brilliant historian. This guy said Churchill was the greatest villain of World War II and that Hitler didn't really want to fight. And Donald Trump is ending his campaign apparently with Tucker Carlson. So the anti-Semitism that the Republican Party is now excusing and accommodating is despicable, and is despicable no matter who is doing it. There are certainly things that I've said that I wouldn't have said, or that I would have said in a different way. There's no question. I always think about when Speaker Pelosi appointed me to the Select Committee, and one of her staffers was trying to get her not to appoint me, and handed her a piece of paper that said, "These are the top 10 worst things Liz Cheney has ever said about Nancy Pelosi." And I was really glad that they stopped at 10, because I didn't know what else was out there. I mean, I don't remember, but I'm sure it wasn't good.
Yeah, you do.
I don't. It had something to do with her spine not reaching her brain, I think it was. But look, I think that it goes to the previous point that, you know, it can be very easy in politics, especially I think in Congress, to sort of go to your corner and say, all right, this is where all the Republicans are, this is where all the Democrats are. Any idea that comes from the other side, we're going to fight against and try to defeat. And I wish that I hadn't done that as many times as I did.
Let's say...
But I don't...
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, please.
But I also think it's really important, you know, for certainly I have said some things that I, you know, would say differently, or wish I hadn't said. But I also know that, you know, there have been some pretty mean things said about me, and more importantly, some pretty mean things said about my dad. And I think that all of us really need to say, all right, we can disagree on policy, but we ought to step back from this abyss of, you know, launching the worst kind of attack, because then, number one, we can't move forward together, but number two, when we have the threat that we have now, you know, you want to be able to convey to people, this really matters. This is really much beyond politics.
Let's explore that a little bit. Let's say you're wrong. Let's say Trump wins. Either result, is there a very real chance of political violence in this country in the weeks and months to come?
Well, I think that there is a very, very clear intention, and you see it among some of Donald Trump's supporters, for example, threats that they are posting online, threats specifically around the election, the threats that we know that election workers are facing. I think that the kind of chaos and the stories that you see, the false stories that you're already seeing that mirror so much some of what we saw in 2020, they're all clearly aimed towards creating chaos. And they also know, I mean, look, the threat of violence, and certainly, Donald Trump himself was the victim of an assassination attempt, which was horrific and never should have happened. And the fact that there's a bipartisan congressional committee that is investigating that is very important. But all of us ought to be able to say we're going to reject violence in politics. And when you had members, Republican members, who were unwilling to vote to impeach Trump, and some of them said to me it was because they were afraid of violence. That tells you how much our politics had already begun to change, and why it's so important to reject this.
We have some excellent questions from you, and thank you for them. One of them is, Trump ran against Nikki Haley in the primary. Nikki Haley here and there did quite well. Certainly a lot of votes that could mean a lot in swing states if they swing to Harris. Nikki Haley, of course, after saying horrendous things about Donald Trump, has endorsed Donald Trump. But do you think her voters will vote for Donald Trump, or does that go to your optimism?
Well, I think you left out a few swings of the Nikki Haley pendulum. She's had a couple of.
Yes, I did.
But I have been talking to and meeting with people who supported Nikki Haley, and they are voting for Kamala Harris. And I think that you're going to see that more and more again, as especially Republican women, realize that they weren't going to be for Trump, and in the first place, I don't think there's anything, frankly, that Nikki Haley could do to get those voters to vote for Donald Trump, and many of them, I think you will see in early voting even already, you're beginning to see that they're voting for Vice President Harris.
Let's say Trump does lose. Does Trumpism burn itself out rapidly, and the Republican Party goes back to that party that stretches from, I don't know, Jacob Javits to Dick Cheney, or something like that? I mean, it's not going to be a magical transformation, right, is it?
No, it isn't. And the voters matter. And there's been a lot of positive incentive for politicians who sort of model themselves after Donald Trump, people who were elected the same year he was, or just a couple of years after, who watch him and have sort of learned these lessons of say the most extreme things and there's no consequence, or there's even positive reinforcement for it. But that's also why the election matters, and why what happens afterwards. The best way to ensure that the kind of really, as I said, the kind of evil cruelty and the craven abandonment of duty is rejected and is not part of our politics, is to defeat Donald Trump and to defeat the people who are running for offices down ballot, who are election deniers, or the fact that you even have to say this, but like somebody who is suggesting repealing the 19th Amendment probably shouldn't be elected to office. I mean, it's some basic things. But you had J.D. Vance in North Carolina yesterday or the day before, welcoming the Republican candidate for governor in North Carolina, who he said things like he doesn't think that women should have the right to vote. Now, the guy wasn't at the event, and it wasn't clear.
This is the one with interesting internet habits.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But I think, really, it can be too easy in our country to think, you know what, the politicians are going to do politics, and to wash your hands of it, and to think it's too messy, and to, go about your lives and think, well, I'm going to focus on, what affects my life day to day, and ignore the politics. And what we are learning is the danger of doing that you can't ignore the politics. If you ignore it, then you end up with, some of the the worst kinds of elected officials taking office, and it really matters. And so I think the future of the Republican Party and the future of our politics will depend on the voters, and it'll depend upon leaders.
Some of this is reflected in these questions, and some of it is me just reading minds. And it boils down to this question. I'm guessing that a lot of people are thinking the following thing. This has been really interesting, but I'm terrified about the election to come. I've been anxious now for, what time is it? 9 years. And I don't understand my own country, or I don't understand half of the country. Right now, we're having a conversation that hinges on a couple of 100,000 people, whether they go to vote, whether they don't vote, who they vote for. Whether it's raining in Pennsylvania on a given day, that's the razor's edge we're describing. And I think I'm getting this right, am I not, brothers and sisters? There is an incomprehension of the other half of the country, and surely it can't be that the other half of the country is bad or morally deficient or something. And sometimes I read the explanations for this. Bret Stephens the other day in the New York Times on the op-ed page wrote, and it took him until last week to say that, or whatever it was, that he was finally going to pull the lever for Kamala Harris. Fine. What he said was, if the Republicans win, if Trump wins, who's at fault? The nasty liberals who are condescending and terrible to the rest of the country. If Trump wins, who's at fault?
Trump's not going to win.
You're saying that for spiritual nourishment, or you really believe it?
No, both. But I really do believe it. And but I also think that we, as a country, have to really look very, deeply at how we got to this place, and we also, I think, have a responsibility to commit ourselves to working together when we get through this place, as we've been talking about. Look, there are a whole bunch of reasons that we are where we are. I tend to think one of the biggest ones is because elected Republicans failed to do their job. And I say that because you wouldn't have as many voters around the country willing to, tell a pollster they're going to vote for Donald Trump, willing to consider voting for Donald Trump. If you had polled on January 7th, 2021, you wouldn't see these numbers. But what happened is when you had so many elected Republicans sort of decide, well, we're gonna pretend that wasn't that big a deal. The voters, I've had people say to me, if it's that big a deal, why isn't Mitch McConnell saying it's a bigger deal? Why didn't the Senate convict him? And so that's where leadership matters. It's where, it's really important for former officials to speak out, and for all of us to realize, like, it doesn't just sort of happen by chance. We end up where we are, but you have to have people who will do the right thing, and then go home and explain it, and maybe you lose, but if more Republicans had done the right thing, the country would not be looking into the edge of the abyss we are today.
Finally, I want to ask you a question about your own political future. A couple of conversations ago, it was in the air that you might run as a third-party candidate. Instead, the guy with the dead bear ran. It's an amazing story, isn't it?
Did he eat the dead bear? I can't remember. I think he was like,
he found a dead bear, and then he brought it to Central Park, as one does.
That's right. That's right. As one does. Yeah.
It was the whale that he, whatever.
Yeah, right.
But you decided not to run for president. Tell us why. But more, where do you see your political future going? And would you serve in in a Kamala Harris administration?
Well, I'm not going to talk about post the election.
Oh, come on. Sure.
But I will say, not, again, setting me aside, Vice President Harris is absolutely committed to having not just a cabinet that reflects, Republican perspectives, but to listening to other perspectives. And I think partly what I found so refreshing about spending time with her is that she listens. I mean, like, just imagine what it's like to have an elected official, especially a president, who listens, who says, all right, let's talk about this issue and why you believe that, why I believe that. That's like such a basic thing, but so refreshing and important. I didn't run as a third-party candidate this time because when I looked at it, pretty intently, it was clear I couldn't tell myself that I could guarantee I wouldn't help Donald Trump by doing that. And I ultimately that was the most important thing, is making sure not to do something that would potentially have helped him. But I post this election, among my most important, I think maybe my most important actually, priority is my youngest son, who has 1 year left before he goes off to college. And this is my son who, after one of the select committee hearings, when I walked in our house, he greeted me and he said, "Mom, thank you. I'm so proud of you. Thank you so much, for what you're doing. I'm just, so proud that you're my mom." And I was, emotional about this and taken aback. And he paused for a minute and he said, "Now, can you please get focused on my learner's permit? I need my learner's permit." So that's.
And he's driving. He's driving.
He's got a driver's license.
I don't believe in letting kids drive, but okay. Liz Cheney, thank you so much, and thank you.